You're listening to Psych with Mike, and the most important way to support the show is to find us on YouTube and hit that subscribe button. So no matter how you listen to Psych with Mike, find us on YouTube, smash the subscribe button, and we really appreciate it. Now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike and Brett Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan.
And I'm Brett Newcomb.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing well.
Yeah. So there's this thing in professional pursuits called ethics.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times, so when you go to counseling school, you actually are going to take classes that focus on
mandatory
ethics.
Class.
You have to take them. And what you're going to learn is that there's a very big difference between what's called a statute, a law, and what is an ethic, right?
Yeah.
And
a custom, an ethic.
Right. And the problem is that people are going to interpret ethics differently. But if you get on the wrong side of ethics, then there are going to be a lot of people who are going to want to criticize you. So we thought that it would be a good idea to kind of unpack this from our perspective, saying up front that different people have different interpretations, and so there are no hard and fast rules if they're not laws, but this is going to be a discussion about how we see it.
So I taught in counseling programs at two different universities for 30-something years. And one of the things that I would say regularly to my students, and you've heard me say this when you were one of my students, when you go into a room and close the door with an individual, male or female, adult or child, you're in harm's way. Mm-hmm. Because all you have to protect you from accusations and charges is your reputation.
Exactly.
So if someone comes out of the room with me and opens the door and says, "Oh my God, you won't believe what he said to me or what he did."
Or what he did to me, yeah.
Yeah. Then how do I protect myself from that? And one of the ways that you learn to try to protect yourself is following the ethical standards. And there's a huge ethical requirement or standard for counselors, code that the National Counseling Association assigns. And then there are the laws. So, and somewhere in between is the area where we exist.
Right. So let's be clear. I wanted to give a shout out to the duck. That if you violate a law, a statute in the legal code of the state within which you work, you can be prosecuted and held criminally liable.
Right.
If you violate an ethic, you cannot be held criminally liable, but you may be able to be sanctioned either by the governing body of your organization, and so in some way be censured or otherwise suffer some kind of reprieve from the organization.
If they identify a deficit in your behavior,
right,
then they can require you to get additional training.
Yeah.
They can require some level of supervision for a period of time, or they can take your license and say, well, you can't practice.
Right. So, for example, it is a law that you are a mandated reporter, that if you hear that somebody under the age of 18 or over the age of 65 has been abused in some way, you must report that. If you don't, and it comes out later, you could be held criminally liable.
Yes.
Right? It is an ethical code that you should not treat multiple members of a single family. Right. And so, some people believe that is an ethical code. We can talk more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people believe that. I don't believe that.
I don't believe that either.
Which brings us to the question of marriage counseling. I mean, one of the questions that you have to ask yourself when you go into practice and begin to have clients is, who is your client?
Right. So can I back up one second?
Sure.
Just say that the specific code that we're talking about is that you cannot have dual relationships. So a dual relationship that is defined in the ethical code as more than one interest being served at the same time.
For instance, it's unethical to see as a client a member of your own family.
Right. Or
your next door neighbor, or your next door neighbor's child, or your next door neighbor's sister's
or
child.
Or possibly even your stockbroker.
Yes. So where in your panoply of relationships does the line become necessary to hold, and where can it fudge depending on the issue, depending on the duration, depending on the severity, depending on the connection. So it's always a challenge to figure out how to go forward.
But that's what I mean by different people may interpret ethics differently. You should not be able to interpret a law, right? A law should be stated very specifically so that there is no ambiguity. But ethics sometimes are a gray area.
Well, and then lawyers exist to find ambiguity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's another conversation.
So thinking about ethics, let's just think, for the sake of this conversation, let's focus right now more on marriage counseling.
Okay.
So in marriage counseling, what do we see as the ethical concerns that are involved in that?
My question initially, if I agree to take a marriage counseling situation on, one of the ethical concerns is, are they expecting insurance reimbursement? Because insurance won't pay for marriage counseling. For most people don't have insurance that'll pay for it. So if you see an individual, so I see the man in the marriage as my client, and his wife comes in with him, and we talk, and their marriage is a part of whatever's going on in his life. But he has his own diagnostic label and concern. So I am seeing him ostensibly for depression or anxiety or some other issue. Insurance may reimburse him for that, but I have to document, and I have to make sure that they understand. I usually get them to sign a document saying, we're not doing marriage counseling. This is counseling for Joe, and because you live with Joe and he's an integral part of your life, you have things to offer that have value for perspective, but it's not about dancing the dance of your marriage.
Right.
If I see you for marriage counseling, I'll call it marriage counseling. I won't call it individual counseling. That's an ethical boundary for me. So if I see you for marriage counseling, we all three agree, you're coming in, we're going to work on your marriage. Then I began to say, my goal is not to save your marriage. My goal is to help each one of you separately to become more honest with yourself about who you are, and get you to a place where you can turn to your partner and say, this is who I am, honestly. The question then becomes, if this is who I am, do you still choose me? And then you can't hide behind, well, I didn't know that,
right?
Or I thought you were kidding, or whatever. So, and then the other person does the same thing. Right. They say, well, this is who I am. I'm always going to be this person because that's who I am, and I'm not interested in changing that. So the question becomes, can you make peace with that if it bothers you, so that you can endure it?
Right.
And can we find a way forward together as a team?
Right.
There isn't perfect harmony forever. Couples fluctuate. They get angry. They get their feelings hurt. They misunderstand. Yesterday, my wife got upset with me.
That's hard to believe.
She thought I was being rude to her. I put on my earphones and turned music on and went outside to rake the yard. And she was coming out to help me, and I closed the door right in her face. And she's like, what the heck? Why'd you do that? You're being a... Yeah. And I'm like, I didn't know you were there. And she's like, you sure?
Are you sure you didn't know?
You sure you didn't do that on purpose?
Right.
So those things happen, and people get flooded, and they surge. And that's part of the rhythm of living with somebody. And
I want to go back just a second and say, we're not going to make a determination about this, but we are going to tell you, if you are a therapist, whether you've been in business for a long time or you hung a shingle yesterday, there are going to come a time where you are going to be faced with the reality that the insurance company that your client works with, that they have a policy from, may pay for one diagnosis but not another. So for example, they may pay for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder but not pay for something else like
mother-child problem.
And so then ethically, are you going to code your work so that they can get insurance compensation? Or are you going to say, no, I can't call it that because I don't see it as that? And we're not going to tell you what to do, because that is an ethical decision that everybody has to make. But that is one of the most common ways that people are going to be faced with this conundrum of ethics in their practice.
Well, and that's another part of your training is when you are trained about diagnostics and diagnostic codes, you're trained to give the most ethically applicable but
Right.
least severe diagnostic label. Because years later down the road, I've had FBI agents come to my office to talk to me about somebody that was treated for depression 20 years ago. And they're like, this person wants a security clearance, and we need to know, are they suicidal, are they homicidal, did they get, what made them depressed, did they get
Right.
through their, how they cope, whatever. And it's like, that was 20 years ago. So look it up if you don't remember. You should have notes, you should have records, what have you, but we need a report. So then you have to do that.
Right. And
But you also have to have a release from the client to talk to the FBI.
right.
So
The other side of that coin, though, is that I've had conversations with both individuals who were in training and people who had been practicing for a period of time who said, I don't think it is ethically correct for an insurance company to be able to deny coverage for some psychological disorders that they just don't want to pay for.
that's just like drugs. It's not in our formulary.
Right.
We don't cover it.
Right.
So,
and so
like I said,
what is
your doctor, your physician writes you a prescription for a particular drug.
Yeah.
You go to the drugstore, and the drugstore says, "Oh, that's not covered," and you say, "Why not?" And you mess around and they say, "It's not in your insurance company's formulary of approved drugs."
Right. So we're not going to tell people what they should or should not do. If people want to contact us, we will give you our opinions privately, but we're not going to do that on a podcast. But we are saying these are ethical considerations, and people have to make these decisions for themselves, and it's important to do so and make sure that you're protecting yourself to the best of your ability. That's why we always say, if you're going to make an ethical decision, I always say this, I don't know if you agree with this, I say talk to 3 professionals. If 3 people agree on something, then it's probably pretty clear that that is a correct way to do it. Do you agree with that? That collaboration?
I have always maintained that if you work alone, you're at risk.
Yeah.
And if you work in a practice with other practitioners, then you always have somebody to bounce it off of to say, this is going on, or this is what I'm feeling, or this is what I think, and how would you handle this, and get collegial supervision. But if you do work alone, there are groups out there that meet for the purpose of collegial supervision. So you should make sure that you have 1 or 2 of those that you go to regularly to discuss these ethical issues when they come up.
Right.
Because if you're alone, you don't have any other perspective besides your own needs, which gets us to boundary issues that we'll talk about in another podcast. But coming back to marriage counseling, one of the more common experiences that occurs in my experience in marriage counseling is at some point one of the partners will say, you're on his side or you're on her side. You're trying to make me see and do and feel what she wants me to see and do and feel. So you have to deal with that issue. And again, you come back to the question, who is the client?
Yeah, and I wanted to come back to that question. Yeah, let's talk about that.
So is the male the client? Is the female the client? Is the couple the client?
Is the person who gives you their credit card the client?
Yeah. Yeah, who's paying?
Yeah.
And the same thing comes up if someone's referred to counseling. I worked with a man that was mandated by his employer, Anheuser-Busch, one of the major corporations in Missouri, to get counseling, and for which I was supposed to provide them with a periodic report regarding our progress. Not the details of our conversations, but the perception of progress that we were making on the issues that Anheuser-Busch had for this guy. So then you have to thread the needle again. Who is your client?
Right.
Is it the man sitting here talking to me, or is it the company that sent him and is paying the bill?
Then anytime when you would be delivering confidential information to another source, there always has to be an ROI, which is a release of information.
Yes.
And so if Anheuser-Busch is going to send you a client, then that person has to sign
Sign
a
off on
release
it, right.
that says that you can talk to
so
Anheuser-Busch.
how free is that? Because he
Right.
was told, if you don't agree to this,
Right.
you're fired.
Right. I mean,
So,
I'm not
he
saying it's
agreed,
not
yeah.
compulsory, but
Yeah.
I'm saying as a therapist, you have to have an ROI
Because you have to protect yourself
in your
legally.
records.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Right. So then in marriage counseling, one of the questions that comes up is, do you ever see those people separately? or do you only see them together? And I've had this conversation with dozens of therapists, some of whom say, I never see them separately.
Right.
They're always together.
Right.
Others say, I don't have a problem with seeing them separately. May peel one off, work on some particular issue that's causing them to vibrate out of balance, but that's impacting the marriage. And so we do that, and maybe once every month or so bring the partner in and try to do maintenance and buy time for this change to develop and occur. I don't have a hard and fast rule about it. To me, it depends on the couple in front of me, how they're presenting, what they're saying, what seems to be going on. But I do say I won't keep secrets. So if you come in and say, my wife doesn't know it, but I'm having an affair,
Right.
I won't keep that secret.
Right.
But I won't out you. What I will do is encourage you to realize at some point you're going to have to put that on the table. And you and your wife are going to have to come to grips with it and how it impacts your marriage, because there are going to be losses and grief and cost and hurt on either side of that coin. But it's not mine to direct. I don't own it.
Right.
You own it.
Right.
If you're going to go there, I'll sit here and hold your hand and talk to either one or both of you
Right.
while you deal with it. But I'm not going to take charge of it and force it to come out because shame, you've been bad.
Right.
Or because, well, I can't keep that kind of secret. But
Yeah.
I mean, the mandated report thing about suicide, a good example. If you come in and tell me you're thinking about suicide, I'm going to tell your wife you're thinking about suicide. And I may tell your employer, I may call the police.
Well, that exact thing happened to me just a couple of weeks ago. I started seeing somebody, a couple for marriage counseling, and on the psych socials, the intake forms, one of them had disclosed that they had a suicide attempt earlier this year over the summer. And so I don't usually look at the intakes until the second session, because I want to get an impression of them, just without any kind of other kind of information filtering my perspective. So when I saw that, I wanted to bring it up in the second session, and so I started to talk about it, and the individual who had disclosed it said, oh, well, I let them know. And I'm like, so they didn't know? So the other person did not know until this individual had filled out the psychosocial, and then that person had disclosed it because they knew it was going to come out in therapy, and they didn't want this person to be blindsided. So that happens all the time. And you can't assume that the partner knows everything that's going on in their partner's lives.
But again, going back to ethics, you have to have clean boundaries and lay that out with whoever your clients are. If it's a marriage couple, then you have to say, these are how I understand and define the confidentiality rules and how I will apply them. And if you are okay with that, then we can do this job. If not, let me give you a referral to somebody else, because I may not be the right person for you.
Right. So going back to this idea of who is the client, who do you see the client as? Do you have any kind of rules about how you view that?
Generally, I would say the client is the person I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Whoever that is.
I agree with
whether
that.
it's an adolescent or an adult or a married couple. If I see an individual as part of a married couple separately, while I'm seeing them, they're my client, not the couple.
Right.
But it's in an overlapping rubric. So what I may do in the session or close to the end of the session is say, Mike, we have to put this on the table the next time Sally's here with you, to let her know, because it's part of her life too. I feel that, and what do we need to do to get you to be okay with that?
So let me ask you this. If you are seeing someone who is under the age of 18, whether it's an adolescent or a child, and because I've heard both sides of this. I've heard some people say, I absolutely will not disclose any information that this person tells me, and I tell the parent that.
That's not legal.
And I think they're putting themselves in a real position of jeopardy, because that is not legal.
So there are things that I would always.
But you should always have an agreement.
I would have a discussion with the parents and the adolescent, and then all of them together. These are the things I'm prepared to share, and these are things I'm prepared to keep quiet.
Right.
So if I learn that your daughter's not a virgin, I'm not going to come tell you, hey, she lost her virginity, she's having sex.
Right.
I'm going to encourage her to talk to you about that and to talk about how can I be safe, especially in Missouri, which is a political side.
Yes.
But I'm not going to take ownership and responsibility for the decision. I will tell you globally, she's really struggling with friendships and relationships. She's really having some issues with controlling her weight and her self-image. We are working on those. Maybe together we can work on how do we monitor her intake and her weight and her social media and things like that. But I'm not going to tattle back and forth about, if I find out she failed her history test, I'm not going to tell you, oh, she failed her history test. That's eventually you're going to learn anyway.
But I remember very specifically, I had a situation where an adolescent was referred to me, specifically to me.
Right.
And the parent came in first and said, look, if you find out that this cat's using drugs, I want to know what he's using. I want to know how much he's using.
Right.
I want to know how often he's using. I said, I'm not going to tell you that. And I said, if that's not going to work for you, then you better go somewhere. And they said, well, then I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so there are times where you have to make those kinds of calls. And sometimes you don't have anything to rely on but your own sense of integrity.
Comes back to boundaries and ethics and your own sense of integrity. I agree.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, if you are a therapist or a client and you have any questions, again, Brett and I aren't going to give you legal advice, but if you contact us personally, psychwithmike.com, then we will definitely give you either our opinion or direct you to somewhere where you can get more information. The music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike and Brett. Holy crap, this is really good, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as a rule, I don't tend to go back and pay much attention.